The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ian Campbell. I'm with the ANTARA Group, and I want to say thank you so much for joining us on our webinar about mitigating risk in IT and how not to get Sony'ed. First things first, I'm going to pass it right over to Tim Caulfield, who is the CEO of the ANTARA Group. Tim, why don't you take it away?
Great, Ian. Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, depending on your location. Thank you for attending. I'm confident you're going to find the material today timely and relevant. Again, my name is Tim Caulfield. I'm the founder and the CEO of the ANTARA Group. The ANTARA Group is an IT management and consulting firm specializing in the infrastructure as a service sector. We help the leadership and investors of infrastructure service companies, as well as the end user technology services, increase the value of their operations. We're talking about risk today, and assessing and mitigating risk in IT is an important part of the work we do for our clients. In the age where cybersecurity incidents are a regular part of the news cycle, and where corporations and in some cases individuals can be held financially accountable, it's a topic that is both important and relevant to all IT professionals as well as executive management. Joining me today, I have industry experts from both ANTARA as well as Level 3 Communications. From ANTARA, I have Howard Asher and Ken Lee, and from Level 3, Tom Ragsdale and Chuck Day. Let me briefly introduce each of them to you. Howard Asher began his career in life sciences in 1969 with Pfizer. In 1999, with a vision of alleviating some of the life science industry pain through IT innovation, Howard founded BioQ Inc. to address the time and cost of managing information associated with medical products within life sciences industry. Howard served as president and CEO of BioQ, where he was dedicated to creating a significantly innovative, smart, automated system to expedite the medical product information process. Under Howard's leadership, BioQ developed groundbreaking IT intellectual property specific to managing unstructured data in any language. In 2001, Howard joined Sun Microsystems as head of the Global Life Sciences Business Unit. At Sun, Howard led the business unit's worldwide engineering, sales, and marketing teams active in 140 nations. With Sun, Howard founded the LSIT Global Institute, a nonprofit organization. The Global Life Sciences Information Technology Institute is chartered with one purpose: to develop an independent source of trusted IT guidance referred to as Good Informatic Practices, or GIP, guideline for the global life and health sciences community. In 2010, lsit.org was acquired by HIMSS.org. Howard recently joined ANTARA as our Chief Compliance Officer. Also from ANTARA, Ken Lee. Ken is an experienced financial professional who has spent the last 17 years helping companies create value through prudent financial management. Ken began his career on Wall Street, helping GE Capital to invest in both debt and equity securities across the infrastructure space, then rounded out his experience by spending an extensive amount of time on the operating side, where he helped manage the corporate development groups at Exodus Communications and Cable and Wireless America. Ken played a key role in managing the company's acquisitions as well as strategic partnerships, which included the transformation of Exodus and CWA into the hosting business units, which later became part of Savvis and then sold to CenturyLink for $2.5 billion. Most recently, Ken has been working closely with various private equity firms as they consider investment opportunities in the infrastructure space. Along with the financial due diligence and strategic consult, his expertise has been tapped to help private equity-backed companies create detailed budgets, operating plans, performance analytics, reporting packages for managing their business and communications effectively with their various stakeholders. From Level 3 Communications, we have Tom Ragsdale. Tom is a veteran of more than 25 years in the information technology industry. This includes 20 years of computer networking and more than 15 years in information security. Early in his career, Tom worked as a software developer and moved quickly into the nascent space of data networking as it emerged. Since that time, Tom has worked extensively in the areas of consulting, management, and sales across numerous industries, including telecommunications, healthcare, finance, and others. One of Tom's area of expertise is driving and achieving business objectives through highly technical avenues, including networking, security, and operations. Tom has held technical sales and management positions at Network General, Symantec, Network Associates, Security Focus, and Application Security. He currently serves as a Senior Solutions Architect for Security at Level 3 Communications and holds designations as Certified Information Systems Auditor and Certified Cloud Systems Expert. And then lastly, also from Level 3 is Chuck Day. Chuck is the Data Center and Cloud Ecosystems Strategic Manager for Level 3 Communications. Chuck is responsible for strategic partnerships between Level 3 and national data centers and strategic cloud service providers. Chuck Day has been working in telecommunications for over 25 years as a solutions architect, industry analyst, channels manager, sales engineer, and business development director. Before joining TW Telecom, Chuck held various industry roles, including cable industry solution specialist for Microsoft, general manager for telco and media verticals for Tippett Software, European Director of Business Development for Alcatel Integrations, and Strategic Alliance Manager for Limelight Networks. Again, welcome to the experts from both ANTARA and Level 3. And with that, let's get into the meat of the presentation. And with that, Howard Asher from ANTARA is going to get us started. Howard?
Well, good morning, everybody, and good afternoon for our East Coast friends. Let's go to the next slide. So this morning, what I'd like to focus on is optimizing the IT governance and compliance as an approach that we advocate, which is unifying the IT governance and compliance. So let's go to the next slide. I'm going to focus on one of the most talked about industry sectors. Let's go to the next slide. One of the most talked about industry sectors, which is indeed what is called the healthcare industry. And I'd like to focus on what are called the 3 Ps of that ecosystem. The provider, the product companies of healthcare, and the payers. And the verification that this is in fact an ecosystem is that if you wipe out any one of the 3 Ps, healthcare as we know it in the United States would fail to exist. And it's a very important element as it relates to providing the element of their competency, their core competency to the contribution of human health. And what we're learning is even though the core competency is in things like providing health care to patients, if you're one of the providers, if you're a product, you're trying to innovate medical technologies that can contribute to public health or human health. And if you're a payer, you're trying to deal with the logistics of providing the capital to do so. Now, of course, the silent P in this industry, if you will, in this ecosystem, is the patient. And the patient should be equally important as moving toward the center of this ecosystem. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about this ecosystem, the 3P ecosystem of healthcare, certainly focusing on providing, if you will, proper innovation within this ecosystem. So we've talked about the core competency of this ecosystem. What is becoming increasingly clear is codependency on the IT environment. Next slide. So when we look at the IT infrastructure, one of the elements that's obviously important to always be mindful of is that IT infrastructure is only as good as its weakest link. And if there's a link within the IT infrastructure that prevents optimal performance, it's where we see a lot of issues. And we've seen recent examples with companies that are not even in this healthcare ecosystem, like Sony, who is modestly regulated compared to some of the Blue Cross companies that are significantly regulated, and we've indeed understood their weakest link. The other element I'm going to bring to the surface in the next slide is that what we're learning is it's very rare for corporations that are involved in a very regulated sector. Let's go to the next slide. It's very rare for corporations in the regulated sector to have a what is called a governance statement related to IT. And more than the statement is that they establish a goal, and to exaggerate the point, to make a point, is if the board voted that an IT governance they would have zero risk tolerance, obviously that may be more of a pipe dream than a reality. But the issue of developing a governance for the companies in which to operate has to move up to the board level. And we've seen that recently as an aftermath of the Sony incident, where they've moved up IT in the governance mandated from the board of Sony. Let's go to the next slide. So when we look at governance, the best way to begin, if you will, is with a framework. And certainly corporations can adopt a kind of a high-level statement as illustrated on this slide that serves as a framework. One of the elements that the HHS, under a idea of putting all health IT, and I'll remind everyone, I'm sure you all know, that health IT is being defined by HHS, that is any IT that directly or indirectly touches the patient. And obviously that becomes very broad. So last year in April, FDA, FCC, and the ONC, the office under the HHS, released this framework, and it's quite significant. If you haven't had a chance to look at it, certainly you can drop us a note. We'll send you the link that appears here on the slide. Let's go to the next slide. So as we move from governance, indeed we get into the issue of unifying the IT compliance factors. And we would like to kind of break it down relative to, let's go to the next slide, break it down to IT compliance as though that is specifically regulated by either a federal, state, or regional agency. But adding to that is other elements that deal with compliance. Many times, for example, compliance can be company trade secrets, intellectual property, activities related to very privileged communication like M&A information, or if it's litigation, it can involve what is called client attorney privileged information. So when we look at compliance, what we do is we take a broad view. And I'll give you a couple of examples when we look, next slide, when we look at what the omnibus rule, in other words HIPAA 3.0, what they focused in on the data center. You see in the regulations, they're actually breaking apart the primary elements of any data center into regulations that have a significant impact on how a data center should be constructed and considered. So what this means is that we should see corporate policies for such things as security management process. We should see procedures on how that is actually done. And equally important, we always want to remember that we want to keep something like a data center in an audit-ready state. Because when we look at federal regulators, they can enter a facility either for cause or not for cause at any time. It's very rare that they will actually make an appointment to do an audit. So remaining in an audit-ready state is quite important. I'm going to just draw your attention to the last one there, access control. You notice the honorable mention of encryption of data. And we're going to talk a little bit about that because we're going to talk about some of the elements that are called the unregulated part of the so-called safe harbor, is that if under breach of some of the regulated data, if in fact it's highly encrypted at rest, the reporting is really to only the agency that regulates. You don't really have a public consequence, so you end up with this enjoying this safe harbor. Let's go to the next slide. So when we continue to look at the elements that are involved in data center regulations, these elements, you see this type of concern and this type of granularity with all the concerns of trusting a data center to really perform its intended functions of managing both regulated and private data and highly secure data. But when we look again at Sony, what we saw is a corporate consequence, a significant corporate consequence, by having all of their email made public. And it makes us want to ask ourselves, what within our data center, what are the databases that we would not want to have go public? And you know the answer to that. It's very normal for it to say, well, zero is a great idea. And one of the elements that not only Sony taught us, but some of the Blue Cross breaches recently, it deals with this last issue of transmission security. And it's really something that I think all of us have seen not a lot of effort put in on this. But we're seeing that the black hat hackers are using that as a primary tool to disrupt the IT ecosystem and basically flood it with DDOS coming in at significant rate, and then basically identifying a weak spot and coming in and harvesting data while the IT staff is distracted from the DDoS attack. So let's go to the next slide. So the concept that we're using is basically when we look at trying to manage this, the so-called compliance, if you will, and equally important, the governance elements, must be by design, meaning proactive. What we don't want to see is kind of a knee-jerk reaction. Let's go to the next slide. And I think it helps a lot when we actually say the bottom line of both compliance and governance should yield one thing, and that's trust. And not only is that trust by our customer, our clients, it's certainly trust within the internal systems, and in other words, a lot of pride should be developed relative to trust. Next slide. The other element that HHS, FDA, FCC, all of them are trying to advocate is that we use a risk-based criteria. Again, to exaggerate the point with a medical product, if you're manufacturing tongue depressors that are wood, it's pretty low risk, and your IT should relatively be pretty simple. If you're managing things like an artificial heart, pacemaker, or something significant, the risk is relatively high, again, to that silent P within the healthcare ecosystem, the patient. So it is a risk-based process, and for those of us that have been around FDA, they've been using this risk-based approach in regulations for many years. Go to the next slide. So at ANTARA, we use an approach when we help by providing the leadership to begin the process of creating a unified compliance by first identifying all the departments within a company, looking then at the workflows within the department with the heads of the department, and identifying all the IT associated with those workflows. Then we look at what's regulated. At the same time, we're going to take a look at what might fall into governance, meaning things like emails may not be directly regulated, but there may be a governance policy that says we don't want those made public and we want those remaining secure. Once we identify that, we identify the vendors associated with all the IT within each workflow. And then we take a comprehensive analysis of the risk assessment. Again, it's risk-based. We then draft the assessment report, again, by department, and then develop a IT risk mitigation plan. Obviously, the budget is also developed at that point. We then focus on optimizing that and then providing objective review and make sure that it fits into the culture and the budgets of the company and the agendas relative to both governance as well as compliance. And then we make sure that we align IT vendor resources in ways that are appropriate. Certainly within HIPAA, we require a business associate agreement that's delineated by specifically what risk and the exact risk by vendor that they will help mitigate. So when we look at this model at a very high level, let's go to the next slide. One of the factors we identify is this, what is called the Unified Compliance Scale. And we really try and look at the elements. You know, it could be a publicly traded hospital. They have personal protected individual information, protected credit information. Certainly if it's a hospital, they've got lots of PHI. They may be impacted by the GINA, which is an amendment of law to HIPAA that protects genetic information. And then if they have a pharmacy in a hospital, they're regulated by FDA. So when we start looking at these scores, let's go to the next slide, we really look at aligning them with policy, procedure, and process at a very high level. And what the experience has been, if we can go to slide next, what our experience has been that we can actually reduce the complexity of trying to granularly manage each regulation because we've brought it all to a unified scale. And it does really reduce the complexity. It simplifies the IT policy, procedures, and processes, and equally important, the change management triggering effect of how it may mitigate risk, but also modify the way we approach our policy and procedure. Let's go to the next slide. So the element that we're focused on is really to get into a state where it is truly audit ready. And you know, the bottom line we've learned indeed is that it's got to be by design. We've got to take into account that we've smartened the way we're managing these regulated and compliant ecosystems. We've got to develop a great ROI, and we've got to document it. One of the adages of regulators has always been that if it isn't documented, it never happened. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to my friend Tom with Level 3. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Howard. Go ahead and go to the next slide. I'm going to talk about some of the very specifics, what happened in Sony and with the number of companies that it's ongoing. Of course, we're talking about DDoS attacks. And the network is at the heart of that. For those that don't know, Level 3 is a global telecommunications and security provider. And what's unique about Level 3 is our high level of participation in the Internet. We carry about 70% of the traffic globally that goes across the Internet. Just our assets alone, we experience on average about 50 DDoS attacks that are launched at our assets every month. So we're going to dig into this a little bit and hopefully educate you a little bit on what DDoS is, what the characteristics are, and how do we protect ourselves a little bit. Go to the next slide. First of all, the network is actually a means to an end. It's really the data that's most important. You heard Howard refer to various different types of data. The network is the transport to get to the data. When we're protecting the data, really when you talk about information security, there are three pillars that we must pay great deal of attention to. The availability of the data, the integrity of the data, and the confidentiality of the data. Go ahead and go to the next. We're going to talk primarily about how availability is affected by DDoS attacks, but certainly there are some other considerations there. So let's look at a typical network. On the next slide, you see that resiliency is one of the things that we typically will see built into a corporate network. This is fairly typical. We'll have a customer's private network, and by private network I'm really referring to an MPLS network that's protected and not connected just in itself. We've got data that's housed in probably co-location facilities, data centers. Those locations have redundant or resilient duplicated links into that private network, and then the premise locations all have their connections. So that's fairly typical, and we consider that a clean and trusted environment. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see what happens. We will connect to the big, dark, ugly internet. For the clients that I talk with, I really stress to them the fact that when you connect your pristine, clean environment to the internet, it literally is connecting it to the worldwide sewer system, because the darkest, deepest parts of the world are freely accessible to and from wherever you're located. And as I said, one of the things we're going to talk about most is on the top of everyone's mind is, in fact, what happened to Sony is a distributed denial of service attack. So if you go to the next slide, in security, there are known signatures and attack types, taking advantage of exploits and all of those kinds of things. Those are not, that does not comprise what a distributed DDoS attack is. A DDoS attack is a normal, typical information transaction that's conducted in a very high volume. Simply, I can have my computers and my bots located around the world. Just simply ask your router what time it is. NTP is a great example. It's a common attack type, network time protocol. We're just asking your router what time it is. And that's not a problem under normal circumstances. It is a problem when you're receiving that request 1 million times per second. So that's what a DDoS attack really is. It's a normal traffic or protocol type, conversation type that's used, and it's amplified to a degree that it exhausts the resources on the other end. Let's look a little bit deeper on what an attack, really the vector, looks like. If you go to the next slide, you will see that this is the data path that we're after. Data is, of course, at the bottom right, and in between that data and the bad guys out there, we've got a firewall, maybe even an intrusion protection system. There's a router, a server. And as I mentioned, we're going to flood those assets with lots and lots of traffic. And the goal is, there's a couple of different goals. Number one, I may just want to take you offline, take you out of service. That may be one goal. And so really just clog the transmission lines to your facility and your assets. But I also may want to do something a little more sinister. I may want to extract your data. I may want to plant malware in your environment that will allow me to exfiltrate data, or like we saw in Sony, exfiltrate emails and take control of email servers and take that information out and do whatever I please with it. That happens. Certainly firewalls and IPSs, IDSs, those kinds of devices have a function, and whenever we are launching a massive attack at that device, when we see millions of packets hit that firewall, it's a security device, and by default these devices will fail open. So if the box were to fail for any reason, hardware failure, whatever, in this case DDoS attack, that thing is like a gate, and it just lifts up and moves completely out of the way. So an IPS functions that way, the firewall functions that way, virtually all inline security devices function that way, and it's been designed that way for fear of blocking, in the past, blocking valid data that's supposed to come in and out, and that's something that's being taken advantage of. Go to the next slide. One of the things that we're having this conversation a year ago, that I would tell you that some of the largest DDoS attacks that we've seen have been in the 100 to maybe 200 gig attack size. In 2014, there were multiple DDoS attacks that exceeded 400 gigs. And obviously that's going to overwhelm any circuit or any asset that's in the path of that. It's becoming a very common thing to see 10, 20, 50, 100 gig attacks. Those are very, very commonplace. So on the next slide, I have included an illustration that graphically shows a moment in time. Now there's a lot going on here in this image, but essentially what we're seeing is a snapshot in time on December 12th, 2014. And each one of these dotted lines that's going from one destination to another is an individual DDoS attack. They're color-coded and they're coded by size, going from one country to another country. Many of these we don't know the source address is masked, so we don't really know where they're coming from, but others we do. Now, if I were to hover over one of these individual attacks, go to the next slide, and we'll see a little bit of data about it. So I'm going to hover over one, and then one more time, click one more time, and we'll see that I've highlighted one attack that's being launched at the United States, destination in the United States. It's a 19.8 gig attack. But the thing that's interesting to me that stood out about this one is that it's been going on for 58 days. So even with the attacks that we commonly see, that's a fairly long, persistent attack. So I'm not sure, how reliant upon the internet this business is, but certainly their operations have been ceased and interrupted for 58 days. That is very, very common. So when we think about the motivations and the things that are happening with DDoS attacks, go to the next slide. Let's talk about that for just a second. Click one more time. There are many things. A few years ago, joyriders, thrill seekers, bragging rights, those are many of the common motivations. Today, it's more complex, it's professional, it's much larger than that. We have competitors, we have professionals that seek to come into your environment, extract your data, and sell it on the black market. There are hacktivist groups. Virtually every organization in every industry has a body or bodies out there that take exception to the business that we do or the mere fact that we're in existence. So, as I said, Howard mentioned it briefly, that DDoS attack, and I described it as overwhelming those resources. If I can overwhelm your firewall, your intrusion protection system, now I can do what I really want to do is send very targeted attacks into your environment directly. Drop that malicious code, which is going to allow me to exfiltrate or remove data from your environment at whatever rate I want to. Those pieces of information have a monetary value on the black market, and they can be sold. So there are professional, financially motivated organizations and people out there. Not only that, launching a DDoS attack is extremely easy to do these days. I can go to a half a dozen locations right now and hire a group of bots worldwide to launch a DDoS attack at someone if I chose to for $100. So, but the other thing the other motivation there at the very bottom is really truly frightening, and that is nation states. If we go to the next slide, we'll see that in the middle of 2014, for the first time in history, the federal government indicted members of another country's military. So these are 5 military officials, Chinese military officials. They were indicted, and they're on the FBI's most wanted list for hacking. Let's go one more and see what exactly it is that what's listed in their crimes. They're wanted for computer fraud, financial gain, identity theft, economic espionage, theft of trade secrets. So it's very, very real, and it's an unprecedented. We're in an unprecedented time where the federal government has very much promulgated the fact and made it public knowledge. And as a matter of fact, this weekend, there was for the first time the Chinese government also admitted for the first time ever that they do have groups of hackers. In fact, they have thousands of hackers in their military in 3 different divisions that are focused on 3 different objectives. So they have thousands of hackers, and they've admitted it publicly for the first time. So it is a very, very dangerous world, and we do in the healthcare industry as well as just like the others have to be very vigilant and proactive about putting protections in place. So there are a number of ways, a number of things that can be done. to mitigate DDoS attacks. If you go to the next slide, I'll list a couple of things. There are 5 things to remember, to be very, very clear on. Intrusion protection systems can do absolutely nothing to defend against DDoS attacks. Firewalls can do nothing to defend against DDoS attacks. In fact, any premise-based system, any kind of box that you put out at a customer's location or embedded in that environment is going to be ineffective. There are 2 primary ways that have some effect. One is a proxy-based solution where all your traffic flows in and out and is proxied in and out, kind of at a very high layer, at the application layer. There are some real challenges to that. And the best option of all is to use a cloud-based scrubbing mitigation service that will actually use large ingestion centers that can evaluate the traffic, discard the attack traffic, and return the clean traffic back to the customers. Level 3 is one of the global providers and leading providers of that type of a service, but there are others out there as well. So when you begin to talk to partners and potential partners about mitigation and how to deal with it, go to the next one. I'll give you 5 questions to ask potential mitigation providers. The single biggest characteristic for success, that drives success, is the maximum amount of ingestion capacity that a mitigation provider has. In other words, if you picture a funnel, how large is that funnel? It's got to be extremely, extremely large to accommodate these large attacks. How diverse is the provider's internet bandwidth? What is the impact on performance under mitigation? These are things that you want to be having a dialogue about. And then, as a sanity check, you want to ask that mitigation provider, are there any scenarios, and what are they, where your mitigation or scrubbing would be turned off? And similarly, are there any charges that you would incur above and beyond the contracted rate based upon the size and the frequency and the duration of those attacks? So really all of those are there to help you with a guideline to evaluate what's the likelihood of success that that provider would have in both being successful in mitigating a very, very large attack and also making it done, providing that in a way that you can financially get through it. So one more slide. I'll just say, close with the obvious statement that the internet is a very dangerous place out there. So let's be careful and put some protections in place. I believe that Ken is going to go through some financial considerations and total cost of ownership now.
Yeah. Good morning. Thanks, Ian. I'll try to get through things quickly and on a high level so we have time for questions after this. But since we've been talking about compliance and network security, I bet many of you guys are thinking about the multitude of various compliance or network security projects you could or would like to undertake. In a perfect world, we wouldn't have to make choices between projects or make choices about how to implement a project for a particular outcome. Unfortunately, we don't live in a perfect world. Capital is scarce, and we often need to find the most capital efficient way of implementing a project. This becomes increasingly difficult as project requirements seem to always have a way of increasing over the course of time. As a lot of you guys go into discussions with your capital allocators, total cost of ownership and ROI, or return on investment, are 2 tools which can be used as part of a framework to help you evaluate the economic or financial impact of a project and to choose how to implement a project or projects. Total cost of ownership, or TCO, is commonly used to compare different ways of executing a project for a particular outcome. And return on investment, or ROI, is often used to allocate capital between projects when capital is scarce. So what is TCO, or total cost of ownership? TCO is an analytical tool which helps buyers or owners to determine the fully loaded cost of a project over its lifetime rather than just looking at the upfront cost of a project. The gist of CTO is that you add up all the dollars, both direct and indirect, you might spend on a project over the course of its entire lifetime. TCO can be used to evaluate the best, most economic way of implementing a project. All things being equal, what's the cheapest way to provide for a certain outcome? Because TCO incorporates not only the upfront or acquisition cost of a project, but also the ongoing operating cost of a project, as well as the cost to exit or end of life of a project, we need to think about things in terms of those different buckets. So the upfront costs are ones you guys would typically think of. Cost to purchase hardware or software, the cost to design or engineer a project, as well as the cost to implement and test the implementation once everything's been purchased and designed. Ongoing or operating costs would be the licenses for the software or hardware that you guys purchase, infrastructure leases for real estate or network capacity or services, headcount to operate and support your implementation, maintenance for all the equipment, software, real estate or network that you guys buy, and some costs that you should think about, but which are typically not part of an IT budget, are power, cooling, and security. These three costs, and some others, are generally essentially billed for, and you guys should think about them when you guys are thinking about the cost of a project. One last thing on the operating side you guys should think about is the cost of downtime or poor performance of your implementation. It's a little bit harder to quantify, but it's also a cost. It's also a cost, ongoing operating cost. And the last bucket you guys should think about is the future costs, which come with at the end of the life of a project. So those would be replacement of an implementation, the upgrade of an implementation, or the exit or decommissioning costs that come with at the end of a project's life. All things being equal, total cost of ownership will often point you towards outsourcing versus doing something in-house. This generally stems from the fact that outsourcers often have expertise and economies of scale, which come from specializing in doing one or a few tasks over and over. That being said, while TCO is a great tool, it can often be imprecise because it doesn't adjust for the length of a project's lifetime. It also treats all future cash flows as being equal and doesn't take into account the time value of money. ROI is another tool which tries to help to mitigate the lifetime issue, which comes with TCO. It's used to evaluate the capital efficiency or profitability of an upfront investment. It allows one to compare different levels of profitability across varying upfront investments by normalizing for the size of said upfront investment. This is done by dividing the profitability of a project by the upfront investment for said project, profitability in this case being defined as revenue less operating costs for a given period. As you might expect, with ROI, generally the higher the better. While flexible, ROI has a tendency to be biased towards projects or scenarios with lower upfront costs, but this depends on the magnitude of trade-off between the upfront costs and the operating expenses. As with TCO, all things being equal, it will generally point towards outsourcing versus doing something in-house. That said, a shortcoming of ROI is that it's just a snapshot in time, and ROI can vary over a project's lifetime. And like TCO, ROI doesn't really take into account the time value of money. And I guess with that, I'll turn this back to Ian so we can go through some Q&A.
Can you hear me now? There was, it sounds like there was, oh, there we go, okay. So as Ken said, we're going to do a little bit of Q&A, and so there is a questions panel down in the on the bottom right-hand side of your GoToWebinar dashboard that you can open up and submit questions. We have a few coming in so far. One of which is right off the bat to go with, and again, we've got all of our panelists unmuted here, so they'll be able to answer as needed. I believe this one is, Ken, this one's probably for you. Is there a methodology for calculating, estimating, or guessing at the cost of downtime for a specific organization or business type?
A lot of people look at try to estimate downtime in a lot of different ways. Some of that is, what does it cost to have backup equipment or services? But generally, it's more of an art than a science. But the more redundancy, usually the better, and that usually has a lot of costs that's associated with it. So it's really might be.
Fantastic, fantastic. Thank you. So let's see here. Here we go. When might an IT executive be held personally liable for compliance? Howard, I think that you mentioned you kind of brought this up before. Do you want to kind of start the ball on this question?
Sure. In the United States, we have 3 agencies: SEC, FDA, and now HHS. All 3 of them can pierce corporate veils and basically charge individuals they believe that had willful intent with felonies right off the bat. and when we haven't seen HHS. Sorry. But we have seen a lot of activity from both SEC and FDA where they will actually charge felonies. They always start with a CEO. That's default. And then any other individual believed to have actually had willful intent. Again, it's very rare. We've got somebody on noisy. We've got to go on mute. So when we look at that, the law, if you will, the case law that's been related to that is very rich with FDA and SEC. So it is there, and it's a big anvil. I mean, it's something we need to be highly concerned with. They also have not only the criminal element, but the civil element, meaning that they can charge not only the individuals by fining them as related to the outcome of the trial, but they can also charge the corporation. The trick that the FDA and SEC have been using over the years is to charge some enormous amount, typically on the corporate side, 3 times net earnings. That's kind of their rule of thumb, so it can get unbelievably expensive. I'm just going to add one little comment relative to Sony. Sony did a press release recently, and it's actually quite interesting how they've elevated their compliance and governance to the board level, hired some new individuals, but they made a statement that resolving or rectifying that breach that began with a huge DDoS attack only cost $15 million. And when I read that, I thought, wow, a small fraction of that investment could have been made to mitigate that risk and prevented that from ever occurring. So it's something that this is, I think, why this whole thing is starting to elevate to board members within corporations who frequently never really concern themselves with IT, more focused on the core competency of the companies. So Sony was focused on great entertainment and that type of thing, which would base it. So I just relative to cost, it can be very, very significant.
And you know, that actually leads pretty well into one of the other questions that we got from the audience here. So what did exactly happen with Sony? What was the we've heard I've heard a lot of different theories, a lot of different ideas. What was the actual what actually happened?
And this is Tom Ragsdale, and there are many articles out there that if anyone wanted the details, they were DDoS attacked, their systems were compromised, and then their email data was extracted. What we don't know at this point, and what Sony frankly doesn't know, is how much other data was extracted that has not been that they haven't been made aware of at this point.
Excellent, excellent. So another question here, how do I know if my service provider meets a specific compliance standard such as HIPAA?
Yeah, I'll take that one. It's a valid concern, extremely valid, because typical of the IT industry, we like to hype things. We all remember Y2K. Suddenly everybody could do Y2K. And we've seen this throughout time with Sarbanes-Oxley and so on. HIPAA, we see a lot of service providers, IT service providers, use statements as though they're HIPAA certified or HIPAA approved or they're HIPAA compliant. Yeah, I mean, the granularity is how did they prove that? How do they demonstrate that compliance? And if you recall on some of the slides, if it's data center, there are some very explicit regulations that relate to data center compliance. And when you look at data centers that are truly compliant, they have a program, number one. It's highly documented, number two. They should have policies. They should have procedures. And they should have very clear black and white process to do various aspects of mitigating risk. The other element related to compliance is within the omnibus rule. What they changed from, if you will, HIPAA 2.0 to HIPAA 3.0 is they want these business associate agreements with IT vendors to be highly delineated. In other words, identify through a risk analysis exact risk that you want the vendor to help mitigate. 2.0 basically was a generic BA that basically said we, the covered entity, are regulated by HIPAA, and the IT industry would sign a BA that was generically saying, yeah, we know that. Today, it has to be delineated. So there's a lot more precision required within the regulation, and it's something that's becoming extraordinarily significant. Specifically, as HHS is beginning to look at some of the breaches recently, the Primera Blue Cross and the Anthem Blue Cross, both breach were not related to PHI, at least admittedly yet. They were PII. And when we look at Anthem, that was a significant breach that's going to impact about 80 million families in the United States. So HHS is really trying to understand to what extent are safeguards put in and how granular the safeguards are developed. Because when you look at somebody as large as Anthem Blue Cross, you see they have a very large pool of IT vendors helping to mitigate risk. And indeed, it doesn't take a mental giant to figure out that they didn't do a very good job at that. So I think we're going to see HHS step up the regulations, step up the audit process, which they have really been lacking. And I think there's a big wake-up call here when you start seeing these very large players get breached, and breached in ways that all like Sony, all start with a DDoS overload of the system. And then they distract the IT staff and then start coming in and harvesting information. And it's significant. I mean, it is significant in every respect. Hopefully that address, I can answer any other element of that.
Yeah. The next question here is actually focused on, for Tom here. What is the best way to prevent a DDoS attack? Tom, you mentioned the cloud, where they're asking you to be a bit more specific.
Yeah, the details of how the system works is through BGP routing manipulation. The best possible, the gold standard in the world is where if I were going to protect this customer, basically they would cease to advertise their IP space, and we would begin to advertise that space in the scrubbing centers that are located around the globe, and then traffic would be sucked into those, evaluated. All of the bad traffic and attack traffic dropped, and then the clean traffic returned to the customer. That's a service that's put in place proactively before an attack occurs, because you have to define the return path. There are a couple of providers, a very small number of providers that have, certainly level 3 is one, that have that kind of investment. To give you an idea, we have level 3 currently operates 8 global scrubbing centers located around the world. All of those are leveraged for any customer because we mitigate close to the source and sources around the world. And combined across those 8 centers, we currently have 4.5 terabits of ingestion capacity. So it is about manipulation of the routing, and there's a couple of different models. And if somebody wanted more details, I'd be happy to send them some information on that, what that looks like. But basically, at the heart of it is redirecting those inbound traffic, that inbound traffic through scrubbing centers that are located at various points around the world.
Sure, be great to have a mirror on the end of that funnel and shoot it back to him.
Well, what's interesting is there's some very intriguing reports that come out of looking at that traffic, both from sometimes we'll monitor customers' existing network, and then we'll make the switch dynamically on demand, or sometimes the customer will choose to route traffic through the scrubbing centers 24/7. And both of those layers have a very strong reporting capability, and it's fascinating to see the type and styles and see that traffic flow, what's happening and how it comes and goes.
So another question here, how often should I consider doing a risk assessment on my IT processes?
Well, I'll happily address that one. So the way we approach it is we create what's called a master risk assessment. Again, it's by department, by workflows, and we're looking at both compliance and governance. And it may, again, I'm going to emphasize, can involve things that are not regulated, like sensitive intellectual property data, sensitive M&A data, sensitive financial data, etc. So when we look at these risk assessments, what triggers a refresh to the master risk assessment is a change. And it's very normal that the change has no real magnitude or impact on requiring the risk assessment be updated. But occasionally they do. And so if you look at the concept of first, the heavy lifting is creating that master risk assessment, and then only amend it due to change that has impact. And typically, you would like to think that the impact should be further mitigating potential risk identified. So it becomes a very living document. It should have a life, an owner. Every department head should own their own, and very much be a part of the group that works in managing risk mitigation.
Excellent, excellent. Well, gentlemen, I do appreciate the time here. We're going to go with that as the last question, and we will be doing some follow-up here with all of our attendees. So any other questions that come up that need to be answered, we can always send out via email, or and this webinar has been recorded and will be posted to various social media channels, so we can we'll be able to post it there as well. If you do have any other questions, feel free to reach out to us. And thank you so much for joining us here on our webinar today. We are looking forward to connecting with you again in the future, and we'll have that be that. So once again, thank you very much to our panelists, to the ANTARA group, and to Level 3, and we are looking forward to the next webinar.
Thanks so much.